In 2017, Facebook made an angry reaction worth 5 times more than a like. And it was the best thing that ever happened to the internet's worst people. Posts that made people furious spread further, stayed visible longer, and generated more revenue than anything else on the platform. The people who learned to perform outrage the loudest got rewarded the most. The question of whether they genuinely cared was irrelevant. The system rewarded the performance either way. In this episode, we explore the mechanism beneath that decision. How the world's largest platforms turned moral expression into a hidden status market, where outrage and condemnation consistently outperform sincerity. How a specific psychological profile learned to exploit it, and what happens to a society that can no longer tell the difference between someone who cares and someone who's performing. Let's start with the thing that made all of this scale. In 2017, Facebook rolled out 5 new emoji reactions: love, haha, wow, sad, and angry. On the surface, it looked like they were giving users more ways to express themselves. But underneath, each of those reactions was assigned a weight inside the platform's ranking algorithm. A standard like was worth 1 point. Every emoji reaction, including angry, was worth 5. Think about what that means in practice. If you posted something calm, thoughtful, and measured, and 100 people liked it, that's 100 points. But if someone else posted something inflammatory and 50 people hit the angry button, that's 250 points. The angry post wins. It gets pushed further. More people see it, and then more people react to it, and the cycle feeds itself. Facebook's own data scientists saw this almost immediately. Posts that generated high volumes of angry reactions were disproportionately likely to contain misinformation, graphic content, and low-quality material. The algorithm wasn't just tolerating bad content, but also selecting for it. In 2018, the company made a small adjustment. They dropped the angry emoji's weight from 5 to 4, and then, in 2019, they introduced a mechanism to demote content receiving disproportionate angry reactions. But it wasn't until late 2020 that they finally cut the angry reactions' weight to 0. And here's the detail that turns a design flaw into something harder to excuse. When they set the angry weight to 0, their data showed it reduced exposure to misinformation and disturbing content, without significantly hurting overall user engagement. The outrage wasn't keeping people on the platform. It was just making their experience worse. But for 3 years, leadership chose to keep the formula running anyway. Why? Because the real product isn't your experience. It's your attention. And outrage captures attention more reliably than almost anything else. Now, if this were just an algorithm problem, it would be bad enough. But the formula worked because it latched onto something already wired into us. In 2017, researchers analyzed over 500,000 tweets across 3 of the most polarizing topics in American discourse: gun control, same-sex marriage, and climate change. They were looking for what made certain messages spread and others die. What they found was specific. For each additional moral-emotional word in a post, not just moral or emotional, but the combination, the probability of that message being retweeted increased by approximately 20%. That's per word. One moral-emotional word was 20% more likely to spread. 2, even more. Stack a few together, and the post becomes almost magnetically shareable. And here's what makes that finding sharper. Purely moral language didn't produce the same effect. Purely emotional language didn't either. It was the fusion, the specific blend of moral judgment and emotional arousal that made content go viral. Outrage isn't just anger. It's anger dressed in the language of right and wrong. And that combination is what the algorithm selects for, because that's what people share. But the contagion has a boundary. And this part matters. Moral emotional content spreads powerfully within ideological groups, liberal networks, or conservative networks, but it loses its power when it crosses between them. The system doesn't bridge divides, it deepens them. It turns each side's moral language into a tribal signal that only resonates with people who already agree. So the content that spreads fastest is the content that makes your in-group feel righteous and your out-group feel attacked. And the algorithm accelerates exactly that dynamic. Now, I'm not implying that the individuals at Facebook sat down and said, let's divide people. However, it is difficult to ignore the fact that optimizing for engagement, which ultimately drives their revenue, often leads to division. Now, there's a second process that makes everything worse. It has to do with what happens inside your head after you post. Social media platforms function as massive reinforcement learning environments. You post an opinion, and you get immediate, quantifiable feedback in the form of likes, shares, and replies. Your brain registers every one of them. When you post something morally outraged and it gets a flood of positive feedback, researchers describe this as a positive prediction error. You expected a normal response. You got much more. And that spike of social reward changes your future behavior. The next time, you're more likely to express outrage. Your outrage hasn't grown. The system simply rewards you for expressing it. Over time, this creates a decoupling effect. The expression of outrage becomes detached from the experience of actually feeling it. People continue to post furious moral condemnations, even when they are not actually angry. They have recognized that the system rewards this behavior, whether it is genuine or not. Researchers call this outrage fatigue. The emotion fades, but the performance continues because the platform keeps reinforcing it. And here's where it becomes genuinely disorienting. When everyone is performing outrage, they may not fully feel. The perceived level of moral fury in a community becomes significantly higher than the actual average level felt by its members. Researchers call this pluralistic ignorance. Everyone thinks everyone else is more outraged than they are, so they perform more outrage to keep up. And the cycle feeds itself. The result is a world where moral discourse sounds increasingly extreme. But people haven't actually become more extreme. The platforms have simply conditioned them to sound that way. So the system selects for outrage. It rewards moral performance. And it trains people to escalate. But not everyone responds to those incentives the same way, and this is where the psychology gets darker. Researchers use a specific term for what happens when people use public moral discourse primarily for self-promotion and status: moral grandstanding. It's characterized by two features: a desire to be seen as morally respectable and a desire to increase one's social rank. And it shows up in two distinct patterns. The first is prestige-seeking. This is the version that looks positive on the surface. The person wants to be admired, respected, and seen as a moral leader. The behavioral pattern is what experts call piling on, essentially restating popular moral positions to register your inclusion in the virtuous group. It's the public equivalent of raising your hand to agree with something everyone already agrees with, just to ensure that people saw you raise your hand. The second pattern is dominance-seeking. This is the antagonistic version. The goal isn't to be admired, it's to shame, silence, or diminish rivals. The behavioral signs include ramping up, making increasingly extreme moral claims to position yourself as more righteous than others, and trumping up, which means inventing or exaggerating moral failings in other people to gain a relative status advantage. Studies using the moral grandstanding motivation scale confirmed that higher scores on both dimensions predict more political and moral conflict in daily life, including losing friendships over political beliefs and engaging in aggressive social media confrontations. And here's a detail that matters: grandstanding isn't exclusive to any political tribe. It's a status-seeking mechanism that adapts to the norms of whatever group the individual belongs to. On the left, it looks one way. On the right, it looks like another. But the engine is the same, and the algorithm feeds both versions equally because both generate engagement. But grandstanding is still within the normal range of human behavior. Most people who do it are partly sincere, partly performing. The real problem comes from a specific personality profile that has learned to weaponize these dynamics. Recent data has identified a social influence tactic called virtuous victimhood. It's a dual signal where a person simultaneously claims to be a victim of some form of suffering or oppression, while also claiming moral virtue, superior integrity, or exceptional social ability. According to signaling theory, this combination is maximally effective at extracting what is called non-reciprocal resource transfers. In plain English, getting things from people without giving anything back. Those resources aren't limited to money. They include job opportunities, social status, platform growth, and something described as moral immunity, a shield from criticism that allows the signaler to behave manipulatively while remaining protected by their claimed victim status. A series of behavioral studies found that individuals scoring high on Machiavellianism and narcissism are significantly more likely to emit signals of virtuous victimhood, and the specific trait that predicted this behavior most strongly was the amoral manipulation dimension of Machiavellianism, the willingness to use cynical, strategic deception to extract advantage. This doesn't mean every person who expresses victimhood or moral concern is manipulative. That would be a dangerous conclusion. But the studies show that for a specific subset of personalities, moral outrage isn't an expression of genuine feeling. It's a calculated tactic. And the frequency of emitting these signals predicts a person's willingness to engage in ethically questionable behavior, such as lying to earn a bonus or making exaggerated claims about being harmed at work. In other words, the people who are best at looking good are sometimes the ones most willing to behave badly when no one is watching. And the platform doesn't distinguish between the two. The algorithm rewards the signal. It has no mechanism for evaluating sincerity. Now, you might think this is all about individuals, grandstanders, manipulators, people gaming the system for likes. But the institutional layer makes everything worse, because the same dynamics that drive personal moral performance also infect organizations. In 2018, Facebook leadership announced a shift toward meaningful social interaction, or MSI. Publicly, Mark Zuckerberg framed it as a way to bring people closer together. However, internal documents and SEC filings reveal a different narrative. The shift was motivated by a decline in original user content. People were posting less, and the company needed a way to keep engagement numbers growing. By prioritizing reshares and comments, the components of MSI, the algorithm effectively rewarded the most provocative and divisive content because that's the content that sparks conversation. Internal analysis warned that this would lead to a deterioration in content quality and an amplification of misinformation. But those concerns were secondary to what one researcher described as the prime directive of growth. The incentive structure inside these companies reveals the logic clearly. Executive compensation was tied directly to engagement metrics, monthly active users and daily active users. A 2016 memo from Facebook executive Andrew Bosworth, titled "The Ugly," stated the position explicitly. The pursuit of growth, Bosworth wrote, was justified even if it resulted in real-world harm. This creates what psychologists term diffusion of responsibility. No single person feels accountable for the outcome because the algorithm, the team, and the metrics made the final decision. Smart, well-educated people comply with a system whose consequences they can see, because their personal and financial incentives are aligned with the system's output, not its social impact. And this same logic isn't limited to tech companies. The case of Gibson's bakery versus Oberlin College is one of the clearest examples of what happens when institutional moral performance collides with documented facts. In November 2016, an underage student at Oberlin College attempted to purchase wine with a fake ID and shoplift 2 bottles from Gibson's Bakery, a local shop that had operated for over a century. The store clerk followed the student out. A physical altercation ensued involving 2 other students. Almost immediately, student protesters, supported by faculty and administrators, accused the bakery of racial profiling. Flyers were distributed calling the Gibson family racists and urging a boycott. The dean of students personally participated in the protests and helped distribute defamatory materials. The college provided protesters with supplies and printing facilities, simultaneously suspending its long-standing business relationship with the bakery. And this case is a perfect illustration of the system we've been describing. The students involved eventually pleaded guilty to the shoplifting charges. In their statements, they acknowledged the bakery's actions were not racially motivated. The facts were clear, and the institution knew them. But the incentive structure, the pressure to align with the dominant moral signal within the community, to perform solidarity, to avoid being seen as insufficiently committed to the right values, overrode the factual record. In 2019, a jury found Oberlin College liable for libel, tortious interference, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The bakery was initially awarded $44 million in damages, later capped at $25 million by state law. After all appeals failed in 2022, the college paid over $36 million. All because an institution prioritized the performance of moral conviction instead of investigating what actually happened. This is what the status market of moral discourse looks like when it leaves the screen and enters the real world. The same dynamics, piling on, ramping up, dominance signaling, and the fear of being seen as morally insufficient, operate inside institutions just as powerfully as they do inside a feed. Now, you might be thinking, Facebook eventually fixed the weighting. Surely the rest of the industry learned the lesson. They didn't. In 2023, X, formerly Twitter, open-sourced its recommendation algorithm. And buried in the code was an engagement multiplier system that tells you everything about what these platforms actually value. A simple like on X is worth half a point, a retweet is worth 1 point, a reply is worth 13.5 times more than a like, and a reply to a reply, a back-and-forth argument, is worth 75 times more than a like. Let that sink in. Starting an argument on X is 150 times more valuable to the algorithm than posting something people quietly appreciate. The platform doesn't just tolerate conflict, it is mathematically built to reward it. YouTube shows the same pattern through a different mechanism. Audits using automated test accounts have found that the recommendation algorithm learns a user's emotional preference and then intensifies it over time. Because YouTube optimizes for watch time, it favors high-arousal negative content, the kind that makes you angry, frustrated, or morally outraged, because that content keeps viewers locked in longer. The platform changed. The formula didn't. At this point, I need to be careful, because this episode can easily slide into exactly the dynamic it's describing, performing moral outrage about moral outrage. That trap is real. So here's what the research actually says about the limits of this story. First, some scholars argue that people unfairly dismiss slacktivism, low-effort digital participation like sharing a hashtag. They point out that low-threshold engagement can be a genuine precursor to real-world mobilization. The Arab Spring and the George Floyd protests both had significant digital organizing components. Dismissing all online moral expression as performance ignores cases where the signal and the action were connected. Second, philosopher Evan Westra argues that virtue signaling can serve as a means for moral advancement. By making certain values visible and accepted through public repetition, it can shift social expectations in ways that pure argument alone cannot. In this view, some degree of moral performance is how cultures change. And third, researchers Jordan and Rand have raised a critical question. Are virtue signaling and genuine outrage actually mutually exclusive? Their work suggests that most people who are signaling are also experiencing real emotion. The signal is performative, yes, but the feeling underneath it is often authentic. This suggests both performance and sincerity coexist. These are real objections, and they deserve honest engagement. What the evidence supports is not a simple story of everyone is faking it. The more precise claim is this: platform design systematically amplifies the most emotionally charged moral expression and rewards the most extreme versions of it. That creates conditions where manipulative personalities thrive inside a system that most participants experience as genuine. The problem isn't that people care. The problem is that the system can't tell the difference between caring and performing. And over time, it trains everyone to perform more, whether they started with sincerity or not. Here's what stays with me. In 2020, Facebook set the weight of the angry reaction to 0. Misinformation went down, disturbing content went down, and overall user engagement didn't meaningfully change. The outrage was never necessary for the platform to function. It was just the easiest path to growth, and even after Facebook pulled back, the rest of the industry doubled down. X made arguments 150 times more valuable than agreement. YouTube trained its algorithm to intensify whatever negative emotion kept you watching longest. The formula didn't disappear, but migrated. And the cost of that design, the polarization, the moral arms races, the institutional collapses, and the people who lost friends, reputations, or businesses in the crossfire, that cost was treated as someone else's problem. Because in the engagement economy, the formula doesn't account for damage, it only accounts for attention. The algorithm doesn't know what's true, it doesn't know what's fair. And it can't tell the difference between a person who genuinely cares about injustice and a person who's learned that performing care is the fastest route to influence. All it knows is what keeps you engaged. And what keeps you engaged is rage. The question worth sitting with isn't whether virtue signaling exists. It obviously does. The question is whether you can still tell, in yourself, the difference between the thing you actually believe and the thing the system trained you to say. Because that gap between what you feel and what you perform is where the real cost lives, and the algorithm doesn't care which side of it you're on. But the marketplace of outrage is only one layer of the design. Underneath it sits something more fundamental, the behavioral system that keeps you locked inside the feed long enough for the outrage to reach you in the first place. That system has a name, a formula, and a paper trail now entering federal courtrooms. We investigated how that works here.